Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fall 2022 version of Rock and Roll Book Club. This fall, I've decided to take a look at the books that talk about the sociology of rock and roll, specifically about who gets to make rock, who gets to be involved with it, who gets to be on the sidelines, and how each kind of person who's involved in each kind of activity ends up getting, being considered part of a system or not. So for tonight's book, this is a book that actually came out last year, Fangirls by Hannah Ewens. It is a book about fans, not surprisingly, given the name, but it's also a book about a lot of different things about the aspect of being a fan. Specifically, why do people consider fans to be kind of crazy when really part of being a fan is becoming an expert in something that a lot of other people who have similar interests want to know about? Is there a gender aspect to, who gets to be considered a connoisseur or an expert versus a fan? How do different types of musicians and different types of acts get different types of fandom? So how are Beyonce's fans, for example, different from those of Lady Gaga or those of My Chemical Romance? Hannah Ewens, I'll just read her biography really quickly. Hannah is a features editor at Vice magazine, having previously worked at Dazed and Confused. She writes about youth culture, mental health, music, and film for publications that include The Guardian and The Telegraph. Her interview subjects include everyone from Patti Smith to Louis Theroux to Jennifer Lawrence and Sofia Coppola. Over her short but rapidly rising career, she has proven that her intimate, humorous, and analytical writing always cuts to the heart of the subject at hand. And that's a pretty good description with what she's done with this book. This book basically goes into the heart of different fandoms. We start off, for example, with the fans who follow My Chemical Romance, the people who follow Harry Styles and One Direction, for example. We get in with the fans. We get to sit with the fans as they're waiting outside the venue at 7 o'clock in the morning, the day of the show, and they're being rained on and they're cold and they're hungry. But they also know that within their own fandom, there's an ecosystem. There are certain rules that may be stated or unstated that everyone has to follow. And there are very specific ways of doing this. So in a lot of ways, it's a look at different subcultures too, of how different fan groups behave in different ways. So for example, the Harry Styles and One Direction fans tend to be a little younger. They tend to be quite fanatical about it, but they're nowhere near as fanatical, for example, as Beyonce's Beyhive, who have very strong online presences and who have very, very strong ways of dedicating themselves and basically checking out. And I don't mean in the sense of, I mean in both senses of the phrasal verb. Checking out is into investigate, but checking out is into getting rid of the people who really don't belong in the Beyonce Beyhive universe. And we get a really good idea of why fandom becomes almost a type of friendship as well, in the sense of what people do or don't hold against other people, how people accept one another, how do people gain credentials, and how do people become, get social credit basically and standing within groups to become members of the groups, to become leaders of the groups, to become definite authority figures. The interesting thing about this book is that it very well could have been a book that was kind of like more of an academic text on fandom, the sociology of fandom, the psychology of fandom. And at the same time, sorry, I just realized that I don't know. Okay, the microphone is working, sorry. Tech problems. It's not like it would have been the first time. It talks, even though it's not an academic text, she does talk to a lot of academics about this. Academics who themselves are fans and who are unabashed fans of different groups and different artists, to ask about, like, is this normal? Do we consider it normal? And one of the things that a lot of the academics come back with is that, yeah, it's normal. The difference is because you're seeing it in such a rarefied and such a specific environment, we may not recognize that these are things that happen all the time in society at large. It's just because it's happening in such a concentrated area, we look at it and go, oh, well, that's really crazy. So for example, with My Chemical Romance and the whole emo thing in 2006, 2007, when the British press started taking on the whole idea of maybe this is causing teen suicides, maybe some teen suicides are attributable to this, The whole protest movement that the fans of My Chemical Romance started in the UK to fight against this disinformation campaign does take a lot of, takes a lot of initiative, and a lot of, has a lot strong basis in a lot of different kind of protest movements as a whole. So that's a neat thing about it, is that the more you read this book, the more you realize, yeah, being a fan is not that unusual. Now, mind you, this book also doesn't really quite touch on the whole idea of standing somebody, being like, someone whose fandom is so absolute and so all encompassing that maybe it just can be a little dysfunctional. She addresses the dysfunction, but she says that, the dysfunction, that it's not the main part of the fandom that you see with these girls and young women. It's just that they're very much experts. They're coming together with other people, and really there's nothing that's that different about them that you wouldn't see for fans of a sports team, for example, or Star Trek, or a million other different fandoms that exist. And speaking as somebody who's been around fandom, or been around for a fair few decades now, I remember when people started talking about fandoms, and realizing fandoms were a thing, not so much in the 1960s and the 1950s and 60s, although, my mother was a fan of Elvis Presley, and there's a whole story that I should probably write on the blog about how she and 3 of her friends who were Elvis fans used to take off in the middle of the night because their parents all worked shift work. They were blue collar workers. And they jump on the Voyager bus to Montreal to catch all these acts like Little Richard and Elvis and, the Big Bopper in the 1950s and at the old Montreal Forum, and, get back before their parents. That's a true story. And I will put that in the blog someday, although I've written previously about my mom's fandom of Elvis. People understood that there was Beatlemania. People understood that Elvis had fans, but we didn't really think about it as kind of like a social movement or as a way of bringing different people together, until people started looking at different subcultures in the 1970s and saying, well, what does make a subculture? How does a subculture vary from just a bunch of people who are interested in different things, which is something we'll talk about in our next book for Rock and Roll Book Club. And the overall reassuring thing about it is that you read this book, you think about your fandom, you think about the kinds of things that you've thought of, or maybe you've done with your fandom, like you've gone tripping on the road to see, a favorite group 3 or 4 times. That's totally normal. You stay up at night having, fantasies of a certain sort that, you've gotten pulled in to play with your favorite band. That's totally normal, because fandom is not just a way of identifying with kind of music or a kind of different, musical movement. It's also how we make sense of our own lives, and how we use art to contextualize what's happening with us. And that crushes can be a way of projecting what we would really, really like to have in our own lives that we see in our crushes and our rock and roll fans, of the people we may be fans of, and just say, hey, you know what, we just want a little bit of that for ourselves. So that's the book for this week. That is Fangirls by Hannah Ewens. Now, I don't think this has actually been published in Canada, or I don't think there are any North American presses that have handled this one. I actually got this one through Book Depository in the UK, which is a much better alternative for ordering books from England if you don't particularly want to go to, behemoth industrial complexes. It's published by Hardy Grant Quadrille Books in the UK. And it is for somebody who is a real fan of understanding how sociologies develop and how cultures develop. This is the book for you, because I think you'll find that it's an interesting way of being able to suss out and tease out different ways of looking at fans and at fandom, where those things have always been kind of criticized or looked down upon as being lesser, but really they're just a reflection of society as a whole. So again, that's Fangirls, Scenes from Modern Music Culture by Hannah Ewens. And that actually ties in really nicely with the book for the next one. And please don't be scared by the size of the book. I guarantee you it's an engaging read. It is England's Dreaming, Sex Pistols and Punk Rock by John Savage. There is a fairly interesting tie-in with current events, let's say, of certain Queen's passing, given that a lot of this book is set in and around 1977, which was the jubilee, the first jubilee of Queen Elizabeth, and how a lot of punk rock was a reactionary movement to what they saw as, or what punk rock people fans, designers, musicians, publicists, the whole people in the entire ecosystem really thought about as what they wanted from England, 25, 30 years after the Second World War, as they were trying to rebuild England into something better. Now, that seems really distant because, again, we're talking about something that happened 45, 50, 45, nearly 50 years ago. But it's very, very relevant when we're talking also about how music can create movements to be able to move things ahead and just even cut off from the past, or just even say, you know what, it's been going like this, everything we know has been going like this. We need to move it sideways because it needs to go in a new direction, because the direction that it has been going in hasn't served anything. This is as comprehensive a book about punk rock and about England in the late 1970s that you're ever going to get. And it is, in spite of its girth, it is actually a really quick, engaging read. John Ronson is a fun writer. He really brings you into what that whole world felt like in 1977. And it's amazing to see the names, the movements, the bands, the musicians who were involved in the scene at that point in time, just how much effect and how much of an echo that these people have, even today. Some, nearly 50 years after punk rock started, 45, something like that. Anyway, again, that's England's Dreaming, Sex Pistols and Punk Rock, John Savage, published by Faber and Faber. However, as a lot of you may know, if you watch Rock and Roll Book Club regularly, I'm also a great proponent of the Ontario library system. If you are in Ontario and your local library does not carry this book, feel free to hit up your local librarian for the interlibrary loan, because they'll be able to fix you up with a copy of this, and you'll be able to borrow it out of any library in Ontario as if you were borrowing it from your own library. So be able to hit that up. So again, that's October 4th, England's Dreaming, Sex Pistols and Punk Rock by John Savage. I'm Dawn Sav. This has been the Rock and Roll Book Club. So read on, rock on, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Take care.